I thought that was very peculiar about Diane is that we're in the same angels group. We see a lot of businesses. We see a lot of entrepreneurs who have great ideas, but the value is really in the execution. And that's how you get your sweat equity, and you really have to do the work. So Diane is graciously agreed to run us through the process that works at corporations, but also at startups. And we start to understand, how do you sweat that equity that you want to earn?
Let's start with a very simple question. How did you get to Silicon Valley?
We're going to do it. So we moved out here just about 20 years ago, and that's how I got my first job at HP. And that was very much the time in Silicon Valley when manufacturing was starting to move from local manufacturing here in the Bay Area or even anywhere within the US and starting to move over to, at that time, Taiwan and eventually China. So that's where consumer electronics and all those things started going. And as that was moving, I ended up doing a little bit less engineering and a little bit more program management and team management. And that ended up snowballing into years and years of running product teams for bigger and bigger operations. And then after a while doing that, I said, you know what, I'm going to stop for a while and try to do something else. And now I'm hopefully giving back and helping companies, and particularly women entrepreneurs, start their own companies.
That's great. Diana, was there anything in particular that made you think you would like to do product development?
I think the answer is yes, in that product development is really a way to learn about something new pretty much every day, because every day brings a new problem. When you're inventing a new product, even though you may have done a new product before and it's an iteration of a computer, for example, or it's an iteration of an accessory or something like that, there's still a different set of requirements, or there's a different set of vendors that you're going to work with, or it's a new team that you're going to have to work with. So the product development process really kind of tickled and fed the curious side of me. And I very much love the ability to learn something new, either by doing it myself or by working with someone else, and learning and growing and broadening a skill set so that I'm not just an engineer anymore. I can manage a manufacturer. I know a little bit about marketing. I know a little bit about customer support. That really, I think, was the big appeal for me for product development, is I was always growing myself as well as helping to grow the company.
Well, it's very interesting. And just for the sake of that, could you explain a little bit more what is consumer electronics and how did you get involved in that particular industry?
Sure. So consumer electronics are really the things that you carry around in your pocket every day. So things like cell phones or laptops would be considered consumer electronics, tablets, those types of things. And I got involved with it really through my first job at HP. This was the early days when Hewlett-Packard was just bringing out their first home computer. And the division was about 70 people. We were making effectively none of them, and we hadn't even made our first dollar for the company. So I had not had a background in consumer electronics. I had actually done aerospace and I had done industrial controls of all things. And coming over to HP is the first way that I found my way into that. And I think what I love so much about consumer electronics is I could explain to my dad what it was that I did.
What was your dad's profession?
My dad actually was a draftsman, and he was also a mechanical designer. He did a lot of mechanisms and kind of complicated machinery and things like that. So I spent a lot of my early years screwing around on his drafting table, making lines and doing all of that kind of stuff. So I think I get a lot of my engineering from him. But I remember actually going into the electronics store with my dad when we first started shipping our computers, and I brought him with me and I said, "See, Dad, I made that." And that was a pretty cool thing.
That would have been amazing. What an amazing experience. So when we talked earlier, you mentioned that you had some information that you wanted to share in sort of somehow structured way, and we're all looking forward to that presentation. Would you like to start? Do you want me to share some of your slides now, or Or do you want to
let's
do
go ahead and do that. Okay. So I think I'm imagining one of the reasons why Alicia asked me to do this presentation for you guys or have this conversation with you guys is one of the mantras that I keep telling people is you have to do the work. There's no getting around doing the work. So my goal here is to try to give you a little bit of a framework so that when you do sit down and really roll up your sleeves and try to either work on a project at work or build your company, you have a little bit of a structured way to go do that and hopefully help you be a little bit more successful. So first slide is if you want to accomplish anything, you need to set a goal. We often will say things or have aspirations about things that we want to do, but if you really want to get something done, then I think about it a little bit differently. And now we're in the realm of goal setting. And one of the things that I learned in my corporate experience is a notion of what they like to call a SMART goal. And that's an acronym, which means something that's specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time-bound. So this really gives you a framework to say, rather than a really nebulous idea, you can come up with something really focused and a way for you to make sure that it's something that you can measure. Because if you can't measure it and if it doesn't have these attributes, then it's not really a goal. And how do you know that you're making progress? Go ahead.
I have a question from the audience. How do you know? Can you give us an example? Can you give us an example of a good goal and a bad goal?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So I'll start with what I would consider a nebulous goal, or maybe a bad goal, which is I want to learn how to sail. So, and that's actually something that I did in the past year because we wanted to learn how to sail. But what does that really mean? Does that mean I want to be able to sail a boat by myself? Does that mean I want to sail on a lake? Do I want to sail on an ocean? By what time do I want to learn to sail? In a week, in a month, in a year? So it's really open-ended. How do I know when I've actually learned how to sail? So what my husband and I talked about doing, because we actually did have a goal in mind, is we want to be able to charter a sailboat and go sailing in the Virgin Islands. Now, this is a lot more specific, right? So it tells me something about the kind of boat that we're going to need to be able to captain, something that's big enough for us to sleep on. We know what kind of water we're going to be sailing in, so that gives us an idea of how much skill we're going to need to have. And we know kind of when we want to do it, because maybe that's a vacation for next year. So now we can sit back and say, okay, this is something specific. I know exactly what I want to do. I have an idea of what the work is going to be, and I know when I think I'm going to need to be done. So now I can start actually putting a plan in place to go achieve that goal. So that would be my example of kind of a nebulous thing and a really actionable and a clear goal.
Sometimes you sort of set a goal, and then within a goal you start, as you go along, you start fixing things along the way. Does it happen that way?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And in the process of setting these goals, as you kind of tick off those particular marks, measurable, actionable, and in particular realistic, that's when you're going to start to modify your goal setting, because it really is an iterative process. But in anything, you have to start somewhere. And I kind of say to myself, I'm probably going to be wrong the first time that I do it, but I need to at least get started, because otherwise I'm never going to get anything done, period. Right? So, yeah. So then the next step in the process is making a plan to go reach your goal. And the process of this planning stage also will allow you to do some goal refinement. And when you're making your plan, first thing, these are the kinds of things that you're going to think about in that process. So what resources are you going to need in order to achieve your goal versus what you have? And resources are not just people, they're not just things, it's time. How much time do you have realistically? And also, how much money do you have? Can you really afford to go do this thing in the way that you want to go off and do it? It also gives you a chance to start thinking about what I call risk management. There's always some chance of failure. There's no such thing as a guaranteed 100% success. But one of the ways that I think about risk management is, how well do you understand what it is that you're going to try to do? or try to go off and do. So for example, when we said we were going to go learn to sail, I had done a little bit of sailing when I was a kid. You know, we'd gone on a couple of vacations with friends, but we really didn't know anything about sailing. So this was going to be a big deal. We were going to have to go through a lot of work. So that's a bigger challenge. And the same kind of translates itself to the corporate world. When I would be leading product development teams, the question was, is this an entirely new product, and how new is it? Is the industrial design different? Is it all new software? Is it an all new chipset, all the internals inside? If everything is new, there's a lot of risk that's going to be associated with this because we really don't understand it well. And we're going to do a lot of figuring things out as we go along. Planning, you want the plan to have enough detail in it so that you have a good understanding of the work that's in front of you, but you can have a tendency to go overboard. And we used to call that analysis paralysis. You're spending all kinds of time trying to figure out every last little problem and iterate on every last little portion of it. But at a high level, we would step back and make sure that the things we really understood was where one group or one person was reliant on another group or another person. There was some kind of big handoff that was happening. And really making sure that we understood those handoffs and we understood what the receiving group required so that the delivering group would be able to deliver that as necessary. That was really the big important part. I didn't care quite so much on that kind of layer below, but making sure that everybody was clear how the handoffs were going to happen, that was really important. So when you're thinking about how much detail to put into plans and maybe you have to rush a little bit, make sure you really understand those handoffs because that's where the problems really tend to happen. And then the other thing is once your plan's entirely in place, ask yourself, now that I've figured out, or at least have a good idea of what it's really going to take to get this particular thing done, is it still worth doing? Maybe it's going to be twice as expensive as I had estimated, or it's going to take twice as long, or I don't have nearly the people and I need to go hire a whole bunch of people, or it's outside of a core competency. There are a number of things that can come to the fore that would then make you say, you know, maybe this goal isn't the right one for me to do now, and maybe I need to do something else, which goes back to your comment, Alicia, about reassessing and saying, maybe I need to modify my goal a little bit so that it's more in keeping with what I wanted to do in the first place, and it's something that's a little bit more achievable.
I have another question here that is coming. When is a good time to reassess the goal, and how do you convey to your boss or to your investors that you will not be able to reach that goal or that there has to be some change?
That's a great question. So the short answer is you can reassess a goal at any time, but the best answer, I guess, the one thing that you would want to do for certain is before you start executing that plan, that's your chance to really assess. And the way to think about it is that's really kind of your first milestone or your first checkpoint would be your kickoff meeting, which is we've done all of the planning. Here's what we said our goal was. Here's how we think we're going to get there. Here are the particular risks and issues that we have associated with it. And either I've got a plan to go deal with them, you know, we believe that we're going to overcome it in such a way, or this is your chance to go back to your investors or your management team and say, okay, here's the goal that we had originally set. Based on all the conversations that I've had, here are the challenges that we have in front of us, and we don't think it's reasonable anymore. We no longer believe it's realistic, or we no longer believe that we can get it done in the time period. But what needs to come along with that in general is, here's the way that I would make a change. Here are the things that I would want to do differently. Either I need some additional funding because I need to hire another person, or, you know, I need to buy another piece of equipment, or I need an additional 6 months, and here's how I'm going to use that 6 months. I would like to drop a few features because we believe that they're a little bit too difficult, or we just don't understand the technology well enough, or I don't have a supplier that can deliver it. So try to come forward with an option. Don't just come forward and say, can't do it. You know, that's never a good idea. But then that's the beginning of the dialogue with either management, the other people in your team, or your investors to say, here's what I think the solution is. Here's why I think it's a good one. Do you guys have any other ideas too? And then you start that collaborative effort of let's all modify the goal so that we're coming up with something that's doable.
Okay, so just changing the goal doesn't mean that you're going to quit the project. It only means that you have to reassess that.
Well, so quitting is always an option. No is always, that's kind of the hidden option that doesn't always, right? Do nothing is one of those, is the fundamental option that you could always put into play. But if you're not satisfied with do nothing, if you still feel that the original problem that was there in the first place needs solving, but I need to go after it in a different way, that's when the replan starts to happen.
I see. That's great.
Okay. So, so next up is where I get to use my favorite phrase, is do the work. Do the work. There's no getting around this task.
There's no shortcut to doing the work.
There is no shortcut. There is no shortcut. Sometimes we get really lucky and everything goes perfectly, and then you end up doing a little less work, but at the end of the day, there's still work that needs to be done. And like I say here, a plan is just a plan until you actually try to execute it. So everything looks good on paper, but now let's go see if we can make it happen. A lot of people use project planning tools to plan their programs. I used to use Microsoft Project very, very heavily. Love it. It's a great tool for planning and assessing. I've seen people do things in Excel spreadsheets, just some way to kind of keep track of what it is that you're trying to do. And you want to keep track of things, but don't be a slave to Microsoft Project. I had project managers that were updating progress bars every day. I'm another 1% complete, or I'm another 2% complete. That was not the way that I would go after these things. I tended to kind of get out of everybody's hair, except for a weekly basis, unless we were crisis managing. That's a whole different thing. So you want to make sure that people are doing their jobs, but again, don't do it all the time. I think weekly check-ins for large groups or your kind of core program development group is a good amount of time. If investors are wanting to talk to you, then once a week, maybe twice a month is also a good period of time. But that's one of the things that you should negotiate. And especially if you're starting a new relationship with coworkers or with managers or with investors, you need to agree how much communication everybody is looking for. And there comes a point in time when you're building that initial amount of trust. So I would start with over-communicating, not necessarily having a meeting all the time, but over-communicate. Here's what's going on, here's what's going on, and then check in over time and say, I feel like I'm sending out maybe more than you're looking for. Let's see if we can negotiate what the right amount is. So communicate early and often, especially if things are starting to not work out as you would expect. If things start to go wrong, you want to signal that this guy's, it's a little bit more difficult than we expected, might take a little bit of time, but here's what we've got, here's how we're mitigating that risk. And when you're building that plan, you're building in natural big checkpoints, either these handoffs or before you're moving into the next phase of a project, where you can call your stakeholders together, be they investors or management or otherwise. And that's an opportunity to say, we were going to be at this point, at this time, at this level of development. Here's where we are against that plan. And if things are starting to go off the rails, you can have a conversation about how big are those challenges? Do I need to do another amount of replanning, or do we feel like we can just move on going and continue to execute as we have things in place?
I have another question here. I have another question here, and this is just a personal question. Whenever I manage teams and we've worked on doing things together, I want to know if we're not going to reach our goal early. The earlier, the better. I get so furious if I don't know. And I know that a lot of people have that issue, especially when you're supposed to be sweet and collaborative and all of that. It's just not the way I feel. And I think if you're running your company and you have a team under you, or if you have the responsibility to inform your investors that things are not going the way you're supposed, that you plan, which is most likely the case. I know it takes some guts to speak up and say, well, we made a mistake, or this doesn't work. I know you already mentioned that when you need to reassess the goal, you have to come up with an alternative. Do you have any tips about that we can share with the audience about having the energy and the guts to say, I need to tell you this now because this is not going the way we need to go, and if we keep going this way, we're not going to get to the results that we need?
Sure. So I think you're absolutely spot on. My mantra was always no surprises, no surprises. And I think the other thing is, particularly at a team level, you really want to foster an environment of, I'm not going to punish you for a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody makes mistakes. We do it all the time. The thing that I was not happy with is if you're continually making the same mistake over and over again. So if you're trying something new, the expectation is you're going to fall down. So don't punish somebody for falling down. Pick yourself up, dust yourself off. Let's keep going and figure out how we're going to move forward. So as a leader of any kind, you need to create that environment, because what that's going to do is it's going to be comfortable for people to come to you and say, I'm having this issue. But the flip side of that is you don't want to wait for people to come to you. You need to go talk to them all the time. Okay. One of the things that I learned when I was at Hewlett Packard, their notion was management by wandering around, MBWA. So you would rarely find managers sitting in their cubicles. They would always be wandering the hallways, talking to their engineers, talking to their techs, talking to anybody. Just, number one, building that relationship. What are you doing today? What are your kids doing today? Getting comfortable just from a human standpoint. Mm-hmm. And then you could just have a conversation about, so, we've got this thing going on next week. How's that going? And I also used those conversations as an opportunity to just generically learn. I would say, you know what? I don't know a thing about what it is that you're doing. Would you mind explaining it to me? Because I'm really interested. Because that let me learn. It built that relationship. And then as we got comfortable, then when they told me this thing is getting difficult for such and such a reason, I would have a little bit of a groundwork to be able to understand what it is they're talking about and start to do some risk assessment. So I guess the long story is, take the time to build relationships with the people that you're working with. And these can be your advisors, these can be your investors, these can be your managers or your coworkers, because if you have that relationship, it's going to be that much easier to talk to them when things start to go off the rails, and they're going to be more willing to work with you to help put things back to where they need to be.
That's great. So a key issue here is that don't wait. Build those relationships towards the people that have a higher level of authority than you, and to those people that you're managing. So you can maneuver. You have some relationship already established exactly. when you're there. I also like your point about being alert to that. When I run a VC fund, we made it a point that we would send a junior analyst to spend half a day per week at the company that we invested in, because they were just there, and we couldn't do it all with the senior people, but the junior people learned. They would come back, they would make some suggestions, they would write reports, and it was just it was a way of just elaborating on our relationship.
I'll tell you, when I used to spend a lot of time in the factories over in China, they gave us conference rooms, and that was where we put our laptops and things like that. But we were doing very, very early prototype builds where we knew that things just weren't going to go right. I never was in the conference room. I sat out on the factory floor all day long, because I knew that that's where things were happening. And I wanted to be there as soon as the problems were found. I didn't want them to, because they write their book report at the end of the day. Here's what we built, and here's what went wrong, and here's how many failed, and all this other stuff. That's great. I'm going to want that, because I'm going to end up sending that back home anyway. But I want to be out there when you're finding the problem, so that, first of all, we can get started fixing it right away. And second of all, I'm not that person that flew over from California that just sits in the conference room all day. I'm part of the team.
Oh, that's great. That's great advice. I got a call, a text from somebody who's listening on the phone, and she wants to know, if you were in China, how did you protect intellectual property?
If she figures it out, I'd love to hear it.
Okay, this is being recorded, by the way.
I know.
Okay, so there's a big secret there. We have to do another call.
Yeah, well, so actually we did do a lot of things. We controlled who was allowed to bring cell phones and cameras on the assembly lines. We curtained things off so that even if people were walking through, they wouldn't glance at something. We were very careful about locking up all of the prototypes that we had. We accounted for literally every piece of every piece part, every finished device, everything.
Okay.
So, and you sign agreements and do things like that. So you have to be awfully paranoid, but things always happen.
Okay. Well, that's good. You have to be a little bit paranoid. That's probably the. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Let's get into the. Okay.
Okay. So, like I say here, small missteps happen all the time, and we just had that big conversation, right? Which is, that things are going to happen. Don't punish people for small mistakes, because you're going to make them too, and just accept that that's part of the whole process, and think about the big picture. Think about how big of an issue it really is, and as long as you're not making the same mistakes over and over all the time, you're probably going to be okay. But take a mistake, put it into context, and when things go right, celebrate things going right. Donuts and coffee are a great thing.
Oh, I like that. I like celebrating. I'm Venezuelan.
Oh, absolutely. Bake cookies and bring them in. Everybody's always happy. Everybody lives on cookies.
Yeah, good.
Okay. So the next thing on here is what I like to call churn. So life continues on, even while you are working really hard and trying to achieve your goal. A new competitor could pop up. A new disruptive technology could show up. Somebody else releases a product that looks exactly like yours. Or one of your best employees ups and quits. There's always something that's going to happen. And new data is always available. So when you were doing your plan, you came up with a series of assumptions, hopefully. For example, here are the products that I'm competing against, and this is the set of features that are with them, and based on that, here's the set of features that we need to have. Or I did market research, or I made some assumptions about who my suppliers were and what they were going to do. So when this new data comes in, you want to go back and look at those assumptions and say, how does my new data line up against them? And then ask yourself, do I need to reevaluate my fundamental assumptions? If I do, then you've got some serious work to do. Then you really got to figure out what the new plan is going to be. And if it doesn't, file that away for future reference. If your assumptions are still good based on that new data, you don't have to go through a big replan. Keep going. And ask for advice. Not everybody knows everything. I'll be the first person to raise my hand and say that I don't know everything. So when this new data comes on board, go talk to the people that helped you make the assumptions in the first place. And that could go back to your advisory board, that can go back to your investors, your management, the team around you. Here's a new bit of data. Once you figure out what you want to do, you need to communicate the course correction that you're going to make and how it changes the goal, particularly if you're going to extend the program by a period of time or you need to do a whole bunch of additional work. You want to make sure that people understand what that is right away. The flip side of this is not everybody deals really well with incomplete information and with change. So in some cases, when there's a potential for a big replan, you don't always want to share that information with your entire team, but that can be dangerous. So think hard about how much or how many people you need to bring in when you do this replan, because some people are going to get super distracted and they're not even going to continue working. What you want to avoid is you don't want people to stop doing what they need to do because there often isn't a lot of time cushion. So I guess where I'm going with this is it isn't always a good idea to tell everybody that you're kind of in a replan because number one, they may not be able to handle it as well as everyone else does. And number two, the replan may not happen. You may end up deciding that you don't need to put that new plan into action. And if people got all bent out of shape around it, you may have lost a week or 2 weeks just in that churn. So you got to manage that churn for yourself and for your team, and make sure that you don't distract the people that shouldn't be distracted when you're going through that.
Could you say that people lose faith in the team if they see a lot of changes?
They can, and I think the way to manage that goes back to the relationships that you have with your team, and also the trust and confidence that they have in management around them. So the way that you communicate, here's the new bit of information, here's what we found out, here's what we think the impact is going to either reinforce that trust or it could erode that trust. And that's why I say you need to be a little careful if you decide not to widely communicate that, hey, we have new data and we're doing some reassessing of that data, because it could go directly to that erosion of trust that you want to avoid. So a lot of it is all about, again, having that relationship with your team, understanding the way people work, how sensitive they are to these kinds of things, and being able to, I guess, change and adapt your management and communication style so that you're communicating in the way that your team member, advisor, investor, management needs to hear that information so they can take it on board. And you're leaving them with the sense of confidence or slight concern, or we should all have our hair on fire, depending on what it is you're trying to do, right?
I have another question here. Should we inform people when things are going bad and we need to change something? Should we inform people in writing, or is it best to just have informal conversations?
I think the answer is actually a mixture of both, particularly when you're trying to figure out, well, first of all, if you don't know what the actual plan is yet, or you cannot crisply communicate what the problem is, I would strongly suggest you don't fire off an email. That's just the hair on fire email, I guess is what we used to call it. Particularly if it's a really big deal, you should go sit down and have a conversation, because you want that dialogue.
Okay.
You want the opportunity to say, here's what I think is going on, and either I can give you a date with a plan, I need your help in coming up with the plan, I have no idea at all. That conversation is a better way, I think, to start. But once you start to solidify how you're going to move forward, then you're going to need to put something in an email or something in writing that says, here's what we've learned, here's what we're working on, here's when I'm going to give you the next update if I haven't solved it entirely, or here's what we believe the new plan is, going to call you at such and such a time to go have that particular conversation. So I think it's a blend of the two, depending on where you're at in the replanning stage. But start with a conversation for sure.
That's great. Do you want to go back to the slide share?
Sure.
This is a great one.